So it is Easter, and we'll get there, but first things first, it's Passover. It's Pesach. We're right in the midst of it, and it predates Easter by quite a bit. And here's the thing about Pesach, about Passover. I was sharing, actually, I realized we were here during Passover for our first week with you last year. It was just this time of year, and I was sharing a bit about my family's tradition and our group that we get together with each year for Passover, and some of the kind of kitschy jokes that would happen year after year. And there's one that I didn't mention. I want to share it with you now, that we would, of course, it's a ritual at Passover to leave a seat open, leave a seat at the table waiting for Elijah. Because in the Jewish tradition, of course, Elijah, the Messiah, were still waiting. In the Christian tradition, it happened, right? Jesus came, and that was it. But the Jewish tradition, no, not so much. So you leave a seat at the table waiting for Elijah each year. You leave a plate of food there for Elijah, a glass of wine. And every year, there's a moment in the ritual, in the Seder ritual, where you open the door to let Elijah come in. And it was, I'm not sure how traditional this is, but it was my job as the youngest at the table to go and open the door for Elijah, and I would get up and do that each year, and there would be no one there, of course, and yet there was this sweetness to this waiting, this keeping a space at the table. And one year I got up to let him in, and I opened the door, and there he was. Steve. He had snuck out, unnoticed by me, and was waiting at the door at just the right moment. I must have jumped a foot in the air. And isn't that why we come to church? To be together, to be together in our waiting for Elijah, or for the sun to return, or for hope to come back once again. And also because we can be Steve, each one of us, showing up at the door, bringing hope and joy and laughter to one another. So it's good to be together. Will you rise in body or spirit, and we'll sing together our opening hymn.
A reading titled, "Crucified Man Had Prior Run-In with Authorities." The gentleman arrested Thursday and tried before Pontius Pilate had a troubled background. Born possibly out of wedlock in a stable, this jobless 30-something of Middle Eastern origin had had previous run-ins with local authorities for disturbing the peace, and had become increasingly associated with a fringe religious group. He spent the majority of his time in the company of sex workers and criminals. He had had prior run-ins with authorities, most notably an incident of vandalism in a community center when he wrecked the tables of several licensed money changers and bird sellers. He had used violent language, too, claiming that he could destroy a gathering place and rebuild it. At the time of his arrest, he had not held a fixed residence for years. Instead, he led itinerant lifestyle, staying at the homes of friends and advocating the redistribution of wealth. He had come to the attention of the authorities more than once for his unauthorized distribution of food, disruptive public behavior, and participation in farcical aquatic ceremonies. Some say his brutal punishment at the hands of the state was out of proportion to and unrelated to any of the incidents in his record. But after all, he was no angel. The reading was a column from the Washington Post this week, an opinion written by Alexandra Petrie. Amidst the chocolate and the bunnies, I think it can be hard to remember that Jesus was, in many ways, a common troublemaker, an ordinary criminal in his time. He was tried and condemned alongside two robbers, common thieves they're named. His story could have been tossed into history's wastebasket, forgotten and unimportant. Petrie's writing was meant to make a political point about how we talk about people who are victims of crimes in the news today. And yet, we are in uncommon times, and yet we are filled with reporting of common events. And yet, not thrown away by history, here we are on a long weekend, all dressed up, singing together, having good food and good wine, celebrating, remembering the life and death and life, again, of this common Jewish rabbi, his message and his teachings, his love.
So the title for our service today came from an episode of a radio show out of Chicago called This American Life. I'm sure some of you are familiar with it. There was an episode called Kid Logic. And it told stories, various stories of kids learning about things and not quite getting it right, or sometimes getting it a little more right. And so this was a story of a dad telling how his daughter learned about Jesus. It started at Christmas time. His daughter was 4 years old. And she was finally asking, what's this holiday all about? Why are we celebrating this? What does this mean? She was a curious kid, as you'll see, but he described telling her about who Jesus was, that it's about this guy who was born this day, and she wanted to know more, so they went and bought a kid's Bible. She was really interested in it, so they'd read this kid's Bible over and over again, and it would talk about his birth and his teaching. It was all over and over this phrase, his teaching, and so she wanted to know more about what that was. And so he talked about, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And this was kind of the core of his teaching. And they talked about those old words and what does that mean and why might it matter and so on. And so she loved this. This was a really significant part for her. And then a few days later, they were driving by a church, a big church that had a big crucifix out front. And she pointed to the guy on the crucifix and said, "Who's that?" And Dad says, "Oh, well, I guess I didn't tell you that part of the story." So that's Jesus, and things didn't turn out so great for him. That message, that teaching of his, it was too radical. It's too radical for the time. It was too radical for the prevailing authorities. He ran afoul of the government, the Roman Empire, and they crucified him. This is how he died. I think that probably took a little while to sink in, but she was only more interested in this figure now, only more interested in this story. And fast forward about a month now, and it was the January 3-day weekend in the States, Martin Luther King Day. And the dad took the day off to spend with his daughter. She was out of school, and they went out for lunch. And there, where they were having lunch, there on the table, there was a newspaper turned to the art section, and across the whole front page was a picture of Martin Luther King. It looked like maybe drawn by a 10-year-old. And the girl asked, "Who's that?" And Dad says, "Well, as it happens, that's Martin Luther King. That's the reason you have the day off of school today. We're celebrating his birthday. Today's the day." And she asks, "Well, who is he?" And Dad starts to explain, "Well, he was a preacher." And she interrupts him. "A preacher for Jesus?" "Well, yeah, actually, he was," Dad says. "But that's, what he's really known for is he had a message. He had a message, and he says, as he tells the story, he says, and you're saying this for the first time. This is the first time she's hearing about this. And you say, I'm trying to be really careful with my words. He says, well, his message was that everybody should be treated the same, should be treated equally, no matter what they look like, no matter the color of their skin. And the girl thinks about it for a second. And she says, well, yeah, just like Jesus. And the dad realizes, yeah, it is. I had never thought about it that way, but yeah, I guess, yeah, you're absolutely right. And the girl pauses for another minute or so, and then she turns to him and she asks, did they kill him too?
As the words from the Washington Post illustrate, the powers that be just like the ones which dismissed Jesus and killed him 2,000 years ago, would likely do the same today. As the father's story of explaining Jesus' life and his message to his daughter illustrates, the radical love and inclusion that he preached still has the weight to upend the ruling order. The message is still radical. The message that all people have worth, that they matter, is still upsetting the establishment. And there is something wrong when humanity is dragged off an airplane or bombed or left to die in the streets. The story of Easter is not powerful because of the brutality of Jesus' death, the way that many films and even the Stations of the Cross liturgy can have us believe. It's not powerful because of a metaphysical resurrection, a bodily return of a human being come back from the dead. It's powerful because communities of people have held on to this radical message, this story, and told it over and over through the centuries to inspire lives which created a change to the ruling order and brought in more love and more justice. It is a message which has challenged empire. It has bent the arc of the universe towards justice. It is a message that asks us to build altars in this world to beauty and to work towards peace, no matter how far off it may seem. The central message of Jesus' life, as I understand it, is we need not wait to act boldly in the name of love. We need not have everything figured out before we invite in the prostitutes and the tax collectors. We need only the courage to begin. Martin Luther King Jr., following the nonviolent path of Jesus, did not wait for the right political moment, for the politicians or the newspapers to agree with his methods for inciting change. He built relationships strategically. He took time for reflection and study, time to find his rock. He, of course, we are aware, was human. He dealt with depression himself, with his own shortcomings, and he lived with a profound fear for the well-being and safety of his family. We are not all asked to be martyrs. That isn't the point. In fact, and we know oftentimes when we glorify the death of a martyr, dying for religious conviction, it can be a source of violence in the world in ancient times and today. But for those of us who do not likely find ourselves as victims of the state or empire violence in whatever form it comes, the story still holds a question for you. What have you committed to? What bold ideas do you stand for? What is important enough that you are willing to risk? We ask these questions of the young people in our community each year as part of the Credo writing process. And as Marcus and I meet with them, we are always astounded to hear how deeply they are wrestling with these questions. Where does this notion of right and wrong come from? Is it my parents? Is it society? Is it the church? And why do bad things happen? And what happens when we do die? We, the adults in their lives, their mentors, teachers, family, and community, we are continually modeling for them what it means to live a life of integrity and purpose. And we are blessed, as we will be in a few weeks, to hear the young people's answers to this question. What are you willing to take a stand for?
So sometimes when this Easter story is told these days, the end is kind of wrapped up with a neat and tidy bow. That version of the story doesn't ask listeners to wrestle with what they're willing to risk for, but to celebrate the risks that Jesus took for them. You've heard that version of the story, right? Jesus paid for the sins of humanity through his crucifixion, was then resurrected, and lived happily ever after. So we don't celebrate literal resurrections. We who have this rationalist approach to old stories are left puzzled at best, scoffing and superior at worst. And yet, the image is an essential part of the story, the image of the empty tomb. What to do with this incredible image, this moment in the story that defies belief? Explanations have been offered. Perhaps some of Jesus' followers got there really early in the morning. They performed a burial as quickly as religious law would allow. Perhaps the authorities removed the body in the dark of night, seeking to deprive his community even of the sacred rite of burial. But the question remains still, what meaning? What meaning do we make of this image? The empty tomb. In itself, it's not an image of hope. It's not an image of resurrection. Resurrection, I think, is found in the choice in what we do when we encounter it. The disciples come to the empty tomb, and I imagine they could have despaired. We've lost not only our friend, but the opportunity to honor him through a dignified burial. But instead, they let it reaffirm hope. It's not the person of Jesus that matters most to us. It is the ideals he lived for, and we can carry those forward. This is from a piece by the Unitarian minister Victoria Weinstein. It's called Being the Resurrection. The stone has got to be rolled back from the tomb again and again every year. Roll up your sleeves. He's not coming back, you know. He's not coming back unless it is we who rise for him. He will not be back to join us at the table to share God's extravagant banquet, God's love feast. All are invited, come as you are. And so it is you and I who must feast for him. Must say the grace and break the bread and pass it to the left and dish up the broiled fish or pour the wine and pass it to the right and treat each one so tenderly as though just this morning he or she made the personal effort to make it back from heaven or from hell, but certainly from death to be by our side. At that service of installation last month, the last 3 settled ministers of this congregation joined their voices in a piece written by the Unitarian minister Jason Shelton, also the composer. As the choir sang, "Many windows, one light, many waters, one sea, all lifted hearts are free," the ministers spoke the words, the precept that is expressed in every religious and ethical tradition around the world. Many words, but one meaning. Everyone deserves love and respect. Everyone should be treated equally. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. We resurrect this truth. Each time we take a stand for equality, compassion, and justice, each time we express love for our neighbor, the ideals, the idea that Jesus and King and Gandhi and so many others have been killed because of, an idea worth dying for, but most importantly, an idea worth living for, an idea worth risking for. Because, Weinstein writes, if by some miracle, and why not a miracle, he did come back, wouldn't he want to see us like this? Wouldn't it be a miracle to live for just one day so that if he did by some amazing feat come riding into town, he could take a look around and say, This is what I meant. And we could say it took us a long time, but we finally figured it out. Oh, let us live to make it so. You are the resurrection and the life.
May each of us who feels called by these exemplary lives, who feel compelled to cast our lot on the side of hope, even in the face of all that is unknown and all that doesn't look so good. May each of us risk in the service of our highest ideal. May we risk every day, in everyday ways, in our everyday lives. Risk inviting someone who seems lonely or a little depressed in for a cup of tea or a meal.
Risk reaching out for help, even though it may be uncomfortable.
Risk supporting a cause or a campaign that inspires you, even if it may not win.
Risk telling the truth to children, to teenagers, to your spouse, to your parents.
Risk looking in the eyes of someone you encounter on the streets. Risk a smile.
Risk connection.
Risk love.
Risk hope.
Risk and live again.
Maybe so. Amen.
Amen.